Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Simon Good and I'm a professional mediator and trainer in conflict resolution skills. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the topic of setting goals in the midst of conflict. How do we clarify the priorities and sometimes I think almost triage the different factors that we're called to when we're in the middle of conflict. We need to find a way a lot of the time to figure out a balance between standing up for ourselves and being assertive and potentially keeping the other party happy as well, especially if it's our boss or a client or our partner or like the relationship that we're dealing with that involves the conflict is reasonably significant. And for me, setting goals is it's the fundamental layer that we need to focus on. These are the different steps that I often talk about when I'm delivering conflict resolution training. So identifying a goal and setting priorities, thinking about the ways to clarify the factors that's going on. I often talk about a process called conflict analysis, the different factors that contribute to conflict and also at an individual layer, what might be going on. We could then think about the different types of conflict, like what are our options for responding and what might be driving it. How do these different individual factors like personality, etc., factor in? And this then all helps us to develop a flexible approach. And the way that I often deliver training myself is that we ultimately often end up talking about options. I'm quite reluctant to tell people you should do this, and obviously listening to me, you'll have a slightly different style to me and a different approach would likely be suitable in a different situation and in your context. But I suppose you can probably follow some of those similar kind of steps that I've described there and transpose the approach that I talk about with the different contexts that you're operating in, I guess. But at the heart of all of this, however you decide to respond, like whatever that plan ultimately looks like, what we're basing it on is the goals. Like if we don't have any like ontological basis, so to speak, like any foundation for the claims that we make, then a lot of the time in conflict, it's going to be very difficult to resolve it. So in a debate type of context where we're arguing with someone and we think that they're wrong, we need some basis, like some grounds, logically speaking, that fundamentally explains why they're wrong. It's not good to say, you should do this, and they're saying, no, I shouldn't. It's like, that's probably not going to get us very far. But the other way that we could approach this is what's called interest conflict, which would be, this is what's important to me, and let me think about what's important to you as well. So this kind of approach can be very useful when we're dealing with family conflict. I'm actually going to go through a specific example of some of the challenges that we had about a year ago with morning routines in my household. We would often end up in big arguments and fights, and it was a recurring issue, and there were particular things that ended up helping to lower the frequency of those fights and also the extremity when those fights were happening. But we can also talk about goals in the midst of workplace situations too. So I'm going to explain a particular case study with a staff member who feels like their team leader is picking on them, for example. I really like this quote from Lewis Carroll: "If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there." There's a similar kind of one I sometimes talk about, which is if you always do what you've always done, then you're always going to get what you've already got. So as we're thinking about our goal, these are some of the different factors that you might consider. What do you want? When we're thinking about conflict and it's a workplace relationship, the what do you want question would be, how would you like things to be between you and the other person? Is it autonomy? You want them to leave you alone a little bit? Maybe that's the factor for you. Maybe you don't mind them giving you feedback and talking about the way that you're working, but you don't like it to be happening in public. We need to pause and consider, like, what is the change that we're hoping for? If you could wave a magic wand, you woke up tomorrow and things were different and things were better, what would be different? Like, what's the thing that you're hoping for? And that often helps us to clarify the requests that we need to make to the other person. But once we've got clear around what are the different priorities that we're managing, it might even be that some of them sitting there on the table are like, look, that's not a big deal right now. Like, obviously, I'd prefer them to give me feedback in private and, you know, it's important enough that I'm going to raise it with them. But I don't want to burn my bridges here. Like, the last thing I want is for this issue to become bigger than Ben-Hur, and then they're telling their boss something like Simon doesn't like getting feedback, when actually that's not the case. It's more about the way that they're doing it. But I need to really think about, well, what have I got to gain here if they do it more privately versus what have I got to lose, like their boss having a negative impression of me or something like that. Like, this is just realistically speaking. I'm not saying it's fair or right. I wish that they would just be honest and give us the benefit of the doubt and appreciate our intentions and where we're coming from, but they might not. Like, ultimately, the way that other people perceive you is something that's outside of your control. So I'd think about what you want, and then even factors like, what do you need? Like, when we talk about, I want to be left alone, how come? Is it for stability or job security, or it's going to help you perform better? Like, what are the factors that you need to operate effectively in the context that you're talking about? And then you might think about the other person. What do they need? What are the different elements that are going to be priorities for them? You would think about the goal for the relationship. Like, in 6 months' time, how would you like things to be between you and the other person? If this is a team leader and it's a really large organization, for example, and you're hoping for a transfer somewhere else, and that's likely to happen, so you're not going to have to be with this person for very much longer, then maybe you just tolerate the frustrating and annoying behaviors that they're doing, realizing that the wiser choice for you is to focus on the bigger picture. But if this is a business partner that you've set up a business with and you're likely to be together longer term and you actually have a lot to do with each other day to day, then maybe that's a higher on the list of priorities for you, the way that they're treating you and thinking about the way that you're interacting, etc. What's the goal for the organization? Like, maybe you've got the partnership, or if you're in a professional role, you might have a goal for the relationship with someone else, like someone in the marketing team. You would like to get more responsive communication from them or something like that. That's your goal. But the organization as a whole would need to generate income and make sure that they're meeting the expectations of their clients and, any other types of, what would you say, like compliance, accreditation, any of those kind of requirements at the organizational level. So they also could be factors that you would think about too. And then how does this all fit into what's important to you? Like, when I say personal goals, what I mean there is outside of the context of this conflict. Like, maybe I'm thinking about conflict with my boss and they're being a bit of a jerk, and I'm thinking about the best way to go about communicating that to them. But right now I've got all of these family issues going on outside of work. My dad's sick. I need to look after him at the moment. So, I don't have a lot of fuel in the tank. I'm not getting much sleep and I'm frazzled, or I've just had kids, or I don't know, we've just gotten married and we want to keep things really happy because we've got a big vacation coming up. Like, there'll be different periods in your life when you're up for conflict and it makes sense to engage in it constructively because it's needed. But there's other periods in your life when it just doesn't make sense to invest the same amount of energy even into the same issue. So I think, this work-life balance idea implies a separation of work and life. And when people do workplace mediations, I think a lot of the time they just focus on the workplace issues. Whereas for me, I tend to at least try to take more of a holistic approach, thinking about the way that this conflict at work has impacted them, for example, but then how has that affected the other aspects of their life? And what else is going on for them, broadly speaking, that might be impacted on the way that they're perceiving the situation at work? Like, to me, that idea of the personal goals, what I'm really talking about is outside of this conflict. Like, these are the goals that are relevant to you, but they're not going to be relevant to the other person that you're in conflict with, if you know what I mean. Like, if I'm in conflict with my son about getting ready for school in the morning, I have a goal that I don't want to be late for my job, but that's not his goal. Do you know what I mean? Whereas my goal for the relationship with him would be, I want him to feel like he likes me. I want us to feel open and like there's a high level of trust between each other. I want to be a good role model. Like, these are all goals for between us. Whereas I also have the goal of arriving at work on time too. So that's kind of like the dilemma that I need to manage. And one of the mistakes I think people sometimes make in conflict is that they project that onto the other person in a way that comes across as unfair. And of course, it triggers a lot of defensiveness as a result. What do you think about all of that? Have you experienced any of those different patterns that I'm talking about there? So for me, this is kind of a process that I like to use. Write a list of what's important, What are the priorities? I think writing it down tends to be quite helpful, especially when you use a pen and paper. It slows down our thinking. It tends to help us structure and organize our thoughts as well when we choose to write it down. Like when we're forcing our brain to write it down and organize it, you'll often see things, maybe you write it down and it's not right, but you know that when you've seen it, whereas in your head, it's probably a little bit more vague and ambiguous. And I think also that helps us in a lot of situations when we externalize it and look at it, we make sense of it differently, which then helps us to develop options. So for me, writing the list is a really incredible way to do it, but you could type it out or I suppose talk it through with someone or just think about it as in my mind, less good option, but those are also alternatives that you've got. You should then identify the obvious priorities. Like there'll probably be one or two of them that jump out at you more than the others, as we really do need this right now. That promotion that I want in 6 months, I'm going to get a 15% pay rise. Like I shouldn't do stuff that's going to jeopardize that in this moment. I can wait until after I've got the job before I maybe stand up to this person that's been, treating me unfairly or whatever else it might be. So then we brainstorm options, and what we're aiming for there is quantity over quality. As many different options that we can come up with as possible tends to be helpful. And you don't want to get stuck on those options. Like I would try to just get as many on the list as you can. Like even ones that are not realistic, like I could quit or I could refuse to do any work with the person until they apologize or something. Like that's fine. Like writing it down, I think what it does is it encourages our brain to shift into that problem-solving mode of operating. And you'll often find then that, you kind of need to white knuckle it through the first few options, but then after that, they begin to flow a little bit more freely. So I think for that reason, you don't want to get stuck early on what's realistic or not realistic. Your aim is to get your brain into the flow of generating options, if that makes sense. So from there, we let go of what we need to. There might be some that are just stupid or not realistic, or you're thinking them through and there's a couple that do stand out as they're pretty obviously the better ones, and these other ones are, a little bit more fantasy or whatever. But you've got a few that are potentials, so you'll need to evaluate them and then develop a plan. The actual response and what that looks like in terms of dealing with conflict, I suppose that would be an opportunity to maybe check out some of my other videos. I've got different ones talking about how to be assertive, how to confront people when they're doing the wrong thing, demonstrating empathy and helping someone else to feel heard, those kind of topics. So let's have a look at a couple of case studies. We've got two here. One is a family situation and the second is a workplace situation. So we're looking at a situation of a battle with a 6-year-old. Now, I can only imagine that I wrote this scenario a couple of years ago because at the moment my son is 8. But as I said, I've tried to de-identify a lot of the factors that I use in case studies, so you're not going to be able to figure out which bits are true and which bits are just my imagination, okay? So every day lately has been a battle to get my 6-year-old son ready for school. I need to ask him at least 10 times to brush his teeth and put his socks on. 10 times, at least. So obviously from the tone of voice that I'm using to read here and probably the way that it's written, that seems like it's too high, doesn't it? Like why would you mention that I have to ask them 10 times unless that's too high? But this is an example of this subjective type of conflict that we can get sucked into. Too high according to what? That's an example of values conflict, and your son doesn't have an expectation that 10 times is too high. He wants to play and he wants to explore his bedroom and he's found this interesting new toy that he forgot that he owned or something. So that's his value. He doesn't care that you ask him 10 times. Like why would he matter about that? Why would he care about that? Why would that matter to him? And I think a lot of parents, they yell at their kids saying things like, I'm going to be late for work, not understanding the fact that you're almost speaking a different language. Like this isn't something that's on their radar. There are options that you can use to offer them something that is important to them or threaten taking away something that is important to them. But you being late to work's probably not as much leverage as you think that it might be. Sorry, mum and dad. And you also have to ask him to put his socks on. So there's a couple of practical things he's doing. So how come he's not doing the teeth and how come he's not doing the socks? Like, is that a willingness problem that he doesn't want to? Or is it a capacity problem that maybe it's difficult for him and he's wanting to avoid the extra work, or he's not sure if he can do it, or like, how come? I suppose there's still a little bit of a mystery there, isn't there, as to why exactly this might be going on. He's constantly getting distracted by irresistible factors like Pokemon cards. The weird thing is, he even has the gall to talk to me about the cards and make a conversation. He's oblivious to the fact that I'm standing there fuming with my hands on my hips, angrily reminding him again to brush his teeth. He's oblivious to the fact. Have you ever encountered anyone like that you're fuming and they're oblivious to the fact that you're fuming? How can we let them know that we're fuming? It seems like there's a bit of crossed wires going on there, and maybe we're experiencing a level of emotion that he's not aware of. And why are you fuming? Like, a lot of the time we experience these strong emotions because, we're getting close to a boundary being crossed. Is it a sense of losing control? Is it a sense of disrespect? Is it a sense of fairness? Like you've given him 3 chances, or you gave him extra time on the iPad if he promised to get ready and now he's not doing it? Are you worried about the slippery slope, that if you're not able to get it under control, how late are you actually going to be? Is it embarrassment about showing up to work and everyone seeing you walk in late? Like, what's underneath that fuming? I often say to people that anger could be considered a secondary emotion, and underneath it is something else. And for that reason, saying to someone, you seem really angry, it's usually not that useful. They're always going to say, well, of course I'm bloody angry, or wouldn't you be angry? Something like that. It's usually more helpful to say something like, if I were in your position, I might very well feel the same way. Or it sounds like you're feeling quite exhausted about the fact that this problem's been sitting there for such a long period of time. Or it sounds like you're really frustrated about the fact that you tried to prevent this problem from coming. You've done your best to clarify things, but nevertheless, it was still an issue that remained, and now here you are stuck in the midst of it. Have I got that right? Oops. So I'll just fix my camera again. So a lot of the time that tends to be quite helpful for people because we're validating their perspective, whereas you're angry, or why are you so angry? It's like almost an implication of you shouldn't be feeling it, or there's something wrong with the way that you're feeling, etc. So there's a few things going on there with the fuming. Why are you fuming? What factors do you need to consider in terms of self-regulation? Like, it's not saying that he's right, your son, to not listen to you, but your anger in that kind of a situation is not going to be helpful. So even if you decide to be assertive, it's going to be more effective if you can calm yourself down first. So what do you need to do in terms of self-regulation before you even go about talking to your son about it, or during the interaction if you feel like you're seeing red and that anger's really rising again? A few times a week, all of this ends in a blow-up, a big argument. I yell, if he doesn't brush his teeth right now, that he will lose his TV time this afternoon. He usually cries or gets angry, begrudgingly brushes his teeth. Then we walk to school with everyone grumpy, him being upset and distressed, me feeling like he's brought it on himself, and he deserves it, probably is the justification that you'd add in there. Frequently when I reflect, I think that I handled the situation really poorly. Isn't that an interesting one, that on the other end of it, often it's guilt? That I reflect and think that I didn't handle it well. We can really get in the habit of beating ourselves up about the way that we deal with conflict. A lot of us don't handle conflict very well, and all of us are going to have situations that we handle very poorly. As we go into that fight or flight mode, we lose the rational capacity to think clearly, and we say things that we regret and make assumptions and overreact, etc. So it's going to happen. For me, I try to spend a little bit of time acknowledging that, but then I want to shift the focus of my thinking towards the future and the solutions. So it's a learning opportunity as opposed to something that I need to continue to beat myself up about. Now, how do we do that? It sounds easy, doesn't it? Like, just focus on the future and the solutions instead of the past and the problems. But, it's really difficult to just switch your mind into that future focus. I really find that there's 4 particular questions that tend to be helpful for this. I came across them in a seminar I attended that was run by a guy called Terry O'Connell. It was a legal seminar, and most of the other sessions through the day were all about the law, and we had different magistrates and judges coming to speak to us about different things. And Terry O'Connell, though, was talking about something called restorative justice, and he was working with victims of crime and their families, really violent crime, like people who had been murdered and, everything that you can imagine that might happen before that in some situations. And he asked 4 questions with these families, both the families of the victim as well as the perpetrator. What were you thinking at the time? What have you been thinking about since? What needs to happen to make it right? I beg your pardon. It was, what were you thinking at the time? What have you been thinking about since? What needs to happen to make it right? And then the 4th question was something along the lines of, like, what difference would that make for you? So the way that I often reframe those is like, what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you been thinking about since? What needs to happen to make it right? Like for me, that what difference would it make for you kind of question, I'd prefer to focus more on the facts about the situation itself. So what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you been thinking about since? And what needs to happen to make it right? When you're stuck on the guilt, and the self-flagellation, even internally, like, oh, I'm really messed that up. I'm really not a good parent. Why do other people able to be calm? I completely overreacted there. I really blew it. Whatever the story is that you're telling yourself, what happened? Like as objectively as possible. My son said this, I asked him 3 times, I used this kind of tone of voice, he did this, I followed up here, my wife made these 3 comments, I said this, I walked him to school there. So suddenly we've got a more objective understanding of the situation, and that tends to be quite helpful because we don't catastrophize and focus as much on just the stupid things that we done. We did a few stupid things, but you can see the build up to it and a few other things that maybe you actually managed okay. It wasn't all bad, if you know what I mean. What was I thinking at the time? I'm going to be late for work. Oh my God, I can't believe what was the story? What have I been thinking about since? It's this really interesting way of connecting the past and the future there. And for me, that's often the point when I'm able to let go of some of that guilt that I might be experiencing. And then what needs to happen to make it right? That's my opportunity to think about, do I need to apologize to my son? Or maybe it's doing something different tomorrow, like waking up 30 minutes earlier or something like that. So we do really need to consider our goals here. And let's go back to the sheet where I talked about that process of clarification. Write a list of what's important. I want to be a good role model to my son. Well, let's think of some options here. I need to help him get ready before 8:30 or we'll be late. Like that's the number one priority that I need to be focused on. I also, though, need to help him develop awareness and responsibility at some stage. So that's another goal that I've got. Like I need to help him develop. It's my role as a parent. I want to have a good relationship with him. I want him to feel comfortable with me. That's so important for a number of flow-on goals as well. Like I want him to tell me when there's a problem that he's dealing with and he needs my help or he's not sure how to deal with it. I want him to respect me. I want him to be a good role model. I want him to feel like he's supported. I want to set him up for a good day to concentrate at school. I want to set me up for a good day at work to be productive. I want low stress. I don't need additional things to worry about or think about unnecessarily. If I'm trying to do a good YouTube video like this, then the last thing I want is to get distracted and be seething when I sit down and I can't think clearly and I can't communicate very well. So you can see there's a whole bunch of different potential goals that I've got that are going on for me in this situation. And that can be really helpful to clarify because then it informs the plan that we're going to take, which of those options that we've generated ultimately we decide to follow. So finally, let's look at a second example. Here we're looking at a workplace situation and it's conflict with a team leader. So your team leader is quite pedantic and often comes to you asking for tiny changes to your work. Tiny according to who? Like, is that an objective or a subjective description of what's going on there, do you think? This can be incredibly frustrating as it often takes time when you're already very busy. You feel like the changes are unnecessary and that the team leader is picking on you because they feel threatened. This is an interesting interpretation of the situation, isn't it? You love the rest of the team you work with and you find them all friendly and supportive. So that's another interesting factor that we could consider. So you might not want to take steps in resolving the conflict with your team leader that would negatively affect the other people that you're working with. or you don't want to quit and transfer, for example. So that goal of I like the people I'm working with would then inform the other options that you could consider. Whereas if you weren't very close to them and you didn't actually like them very much, then, looking for a transfer might be something that you just decide to do immediately and not worry about engaging with the conflict with the team leader directly. So here we go. You're hoping for a transfer to another section of the organisation later in the year, and there might even be an opportunity for a promotion given a few structural changes recently. So this is the potential, but, maybe. You separated from your partner. Okay, so here we're looking at the personal side of things. You separated from your partner 6 months ago, so that's still probably going to be in the midst of everything that's going on, and you're still in the midst of negotiations regarding finance and property. So at least from the sound of it, you don't have kids and parenting challenges to worry about, but you are still in the midst of resolving the finances kind of stuff. So I wonder then what that would mean for your goals. Like, what are the priorities? You might have particular levels of stress that you're looking at limiting, do you know what I mean? Or you don't want to be working outside of work because you need to look over other documents for the legal stuff that's going on. Or potentially you might be wanting to ensure that your money is still coming in at the moment because you're in unstable housing. Or maybe you just feel a little bit like you're in limbo and you don't actually want to make any big significant decisions right now. Like this transfer, that's probably a real high priority for you. What do you need to do to get that? And you don't want to take steps that's going to get in the way of that. You've also got the personal relationships with the other members of the team. All of that in addition to the conflict that's going on with the team leader, right? So what are some of the different goals that we could consider here? Well, first of all, we want the team leader to leave us alone. Do you know what I mean? Like if I think they're being a jerk, well, what do I want them to do? It's to give me more autonomy. Like that would be a more probably tolerable way of presenting that to the team leader. Oh, excuse me, I just needed to do a sneeze. Second, I want the team leader to trust me and I want the team leader to think highly of me. But I've put a question mark next to those ones because I suppose that would depend in reality. Do you? Like, sometimes I don't want the team leader to trust me. I just don't want them to have any grounds to accuse me of something. And they're two very different paths that I would go down, like documenting and protecting myself. That might be just what I'm aiming for. But if I want the team leader to trust me, that's a different goal and probably needs a slightly different approach. Maybe I want the promotion and transfer, like that's mentioned in the case study. So how much of a priority is that? That might be something that's an absolute number one at the moment. Or maybe it's a similar amount of money and you're not actually sure about the team leader in that department anyway, and so it doesn't really matter if you get it or not. You're not going to lose any sleep over it. You might want to lower stress due to the divorce. It might mean that at the moment you're looking at increasing your potential earning power, and dollars is the thing that's a priority for you. Maybe you want the other team leaders to think that you're good or capable or honest or ethical or something like that. Or you want them to feel like they're supported or whatever else it might be. You don't want to feel like you're getting pushed around, right? But that often comes down to I want a sense of control. I want self-governance, so to speak. Like I want to have a say in the factors that affect me. I want to have the ability to make the decision about what I do. Do you know what I mean? So maybe it's that level of autonomy that really stands out to you. Or it could just be you don't like the sense that you're being treated unfairly. Maybe for you, that's the goal, that you're being singled out. And why is that a problem? It might be due to a value that you've got, like you don't like discrimination or something like that. Or maybe you believe in the justice of the process, and so if people have done the right thing, they shouldn't be unfairly punished. Or maybe you can see some systemic problems within the organisation and you've got a bigger goal of dealing with some of those. Like depending on the situation, there would really be different sets of priorities that stand out to you. And therefore, as you've gone through that process of generating options, you might find that as you refine that list, that different ones end up remaining and you consider them, whereas others can be more easily crossed off. So what do you think? How does that sit with you, that way of thinking about setting goals and maybe coming up with a little bit of a dot point list and some of those different factors that I've talked about that you could consider? And has this video been helpful for you? Do you like me going through and doing the annotations and talking about relevant case studies, so to speak? Or would you like something that's a little bit more theoretical? Or maybe it's just more practical steps, like 3 ways to say no, or 4 ways to apologize to a colleague, or 3 tips for repairing relationships with friends after conflict. I would love to know, so if you'd be willing to leave a comment, please consider it. And if you'd like additional resources for dealing with conflict, whether that's connected to workplace conflict or situations outside of work, please consider pressing subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully see you again in a future video. Bye for now.